The sound of the mop bucket crashing echoed to the marble hallway like a gunshot, sharp and final. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. And in the center of it all stood Ion Ralph, his hands trembling, his uniform damp, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that only comes when a life quietly held together is about to fall apart. Across from him, in heels that clicked like a countdown to something irreversible, stood the woman who could erase his world with a single sentence. Zara Voss didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her silence was colder than anger, sharper than insult. The employees watching from behind glass partitions already knew what was coming. She was known for it. The ruthless efficiency, the intolerance for mistakes, the way she could dismantle someone's career without blinking. And Ion had just made one. Before we go further, if you believe that even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's entire life, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Heartfelt Stories. Because stories like this remind us that sometimes second chances arrive in the most unexpected ways. Ion had been invisible in that building for years. The kind of man people walked past without noticing, except when the floors gleamed or the trash disappeared. He came in before sunrise, left after sunset, and in between carried a quiet dignity that no uniform could hide. But life had not been kind to him, not after the accident that took his wife 3 years ago, leaving him a 5-year-old daughter, Hira, whose laughter had become both his strength and his weakness. Every morning, before heading to work, he would braid her hair with clumsy fingers, pack her lunch with whatever he could afford, and whisper promises he wasn't sure he could keep. That everything would be okay, that he would always be there, that no matter how hard things got, they would face it together. But promises don't pay rent, and they don't protect you from people like Zara Voss. The spill had been small. Just a moment of distraction when his phone buzzed. A message from the school reminding him that Hira's fees were overdue again. His heart had skipped, his grip loosened, and the bucket had tipped, sending soapy water spreading across the polished floor just as a group of executives walked through. Zara had been among them. She stopped instantly, her gaze dropping to the mess, then rising slowly to meet his. There was no anger in her face, just something worse. Disappointment, cold and absolute, as if it confirmed something she already believed about people like him. In a building that ran on perfection, mistakes weren't corrected. They were removed. By noon, Ion's ID card had been deactivated. By evening, his locker was cleared. No warning, no second chance. Just a final nod from security as he stepped out into the harsh brightness of the afternoon sun, his world reduced to a small bag of belongings and a silence that felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. The city didn't stop for him. Cars rushed by. People laughed. Somewhere, a street vendor shouted prices over the hum of traffic. But Ion stood still, the weight of what had just happened settling into his bones. He thought of Hira, of her school fees, of the landlord who had already warned him twice, of the nights they had gone to bed hungry, pretending it was a game. He had no plan, just a fading sense of hope and a heart that refused to break, even when it probably should have. Meanwhile, inside the towering glass office, Zara Voss had already moved on. Meetings, contracts, decisions worth millions. She thrived in control and precision, in the clean certainty of numbers and outcomes. There was no room in her world for hesitation. It was how she had built everything from the ground up after taking over her father's company, a man who had once been feared, respected, and, in his later years, quietly withdrawn. He had passed away just weeks ago. That afternoon, Zara sat in a sleek conference room, listening half-heartedly as a lawyer began reading to the details of her father's will. She had expected the usual: assets, properties, shares. The predictable distribution of a life reduced to paperwork, but then a name surfaced. At first, it meant nothing. Then it hit her like a sudden drop beneath her feet. Ion Ralph. The room seemed to shrink. The air grew heavy. Zara's fingers tightened around the edge of the table as the lawyer continued, explaining in calm, measured tones that a significant portion of her father's private estate, assets not tied to the company, had been left to this man, this janitor. This man she had fired just hours ago. For the first time in years, Zara Voss felt something she didn't recognize. Uncertainty. The lawyer clarified further, mentioning that her father had included a handwritten note, something he had insisted be read aloud only after his passing. Zara nodded stiffly, her mind racing, her carefully controlled composure beginning to crack. The note was simple. He wrote about a day years ago when it collapsed outside a hospital, alone and unnoticed. A day when no one stopped, except one man. A man who had carried him inside, stayed with him for hours, refused any reward, and disappeared before anyone could even ask his name. A man who had later been identified through hospital staff. Ayan Ralph. Zara's breath caught. She felt a strange tightening in her chest, something uncomfortably close to guilt. Her father's words painted a picture she had never seen before, of a man who valued kindness over status, who had been changed not by power, but by a simple act of humanity. And now that man had just been thrown out of the very building her father had built. For the first time in a long time, Zara didn't have an answer. The rest of the day blurred. Meetings were canceled. Calls went unanswered. The sharp, decisive CEO who never hesitated now sat alone in her office, staring out at the city that suddenly felt different, colder, louder, less certain. She replayed the moment in the hallway over and over again, the way Ayan had looked at her. Not with anger, not even with resentment, but with something far more unsettling, resignation, as if he had expected this, as if the world had taught him, again and again, that people like him were disposable. That night, Zara didn't sleep. By morning, she had made a decision that felt both unfamiliar and unavoidable. Finding Ayan wasn't easy. He had no social media, no online presence, nothing that connected him to the digital world Zara operated in so effortlessly. But persistence was something she understood, and after hours of calls and inquiries, she found an address, a small, crumbling apartment on the edge of the city. When she arrived, the contrast hit her immediately. The building was worn, the paint peeling, the stairwell dim and narrow. It was a world she had never stepped into before, and it made her realize just how far removed she had become from the lives of the people who worked for her. She knocked. There was a pause. Then the door opened slightly. Ayan stood there, his expression guarded, his eyes tired but alert. Behind him, Zara caught a glimpse of a small room, neatly kept despite its simplicity. A child's drawing taped to the wall. A pair of tiny shoes by the door. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Zara, the woman who could command boardrooms without effort, suddenly struggled to find words. Because this wasn't about business. This was about something far more human, and far more difficult. She saw the hesitation in his eyes, the quiet strength, the unspoken question of why she was there. And for the first time in her life, Zara realized that power meant nothing if it couldn't be used to make things right. The conversation that followed wasn't easy. It wasn't clean or immediate. It was layered with hurt, confusion, and the weight of everything that had already happened. Ayan didn't trust her. Not at first, and he had every reason not to. But Zara didn't walk away. She explained the will, her father's words, the truth she had only just learned. And slowly, carefully, she did something she had never done before. She apologized, not as a CEO, not as someone in control, but as a person who had been wrong. Days turned into weeks, and while trust didn't come overnight, something began to shift. Zara arranged for Hira's school fees to be cleared, not as charity, but as part of what was already rightfully Ayan's. She offered him a position, not as a janitor, but in facilities management, a role that recognizes years of quiet dedication. But more importantly, she began to change the company itself. Policies were rewritten, support systems introduced. Employees were no longer just numbers or functions, but people with stories, struggles, and lives beyond the walls of the office. And